Before we go forward, let me briefly introduce you. You are Dr. Sabine Strauss, Chair of the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, PRAC, at EMA, that we have learned earlier today from Maria's presentation. You have been with the Medicines Evaluation Board in the Netherlands since 1997, where you started as an assessor for pharmacovigilance. Since 2012, you have been the Dutch delegate in the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, and in July 2018, you were elected chair of PRAC. You hold a part-time position as associate professor at the Department of Medicines Informatics at the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, and we are delighted that you have taken some time to explain us briefly today on pharmacovigilance and safety monitoring of the medicines for allergy and respiratory disease. So, Dr. Strauss, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Maybe we can go to the next slide. That is my first the title slide. Great, it's okay. Oh, also okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I think that having the last presentation is always quite challenging. It's often the place that pharmacovigilance gets, but I hope to convince you that that's not directly the best place for pharmacovigilance, because of course, and I'm very, very biased, I think pharmacovigilance is one of the most important things we can do. And as you can see, if we go to the next slide, there's a nice, helpful definition. It's the process and the science of the monitoring of the safety of medicines and taking actions to reduce risks and to increase benefits. And the previous presentation was a lot about paperwork. I think also in pharmacovigilance there's a lot of paperwork involved, but basically I think what we try to do at the PRAC is firstly look at the science, look at the data, and then based on that we take the regulation forward. If we can go to the next slide, then I will talk you through the why, the how, and the when. Oh no, the why, the how, and the who, I think, because when is the when is very clear. It's all over the period that a medicine is being developed and that's on the market. And why do we need it? Well, if you look at the clinical studies, you will see that many of the studies involve quite some patients, but nevertheless not that many that you can always detect more rare adverse events. So often the patient populations in the clinical trials are quite clean, in a different way clean than we heard previously, but they often don't have any comorbidities, or they are, most of the time they are not that old, they're not too young, they're not pregnant, you know, all kinds of populations are being excluded. So we have relatively healthy patients and a limited number. So if we can go to the next slide, I think in the next slide, it's I like the image of the iceberg. We see during the clinical trials only the tip of the iceberg. So at the time of approval, we have very well controlled studies looking into mainly the efficacy and of course the quality. We have some data on safety, of course, from the patients, from preclinical information, etc. But in a way, the proof is in eating the pudding. So we need to monitor very carefully what happens when a drug, or medicine, I should say, that sounds much better, is being on the market and being used by patients, and sometimes maybe in different dosing, or maybe in patients that were not included in the clinical trials, etc. So that's the why. And then who? That's a complex slide. If we can go to the next slide. And that's, it seems very complex, but what to me at least is very, very important is that we need patients and healthcare professionals for the spontaneous monitoring, but also for the other data sources like studies. We also need patients and healthcare professionals willing to do the study, volunteering to participate in the study, and reporting based on their experiences what they feel in daily life once they have gotten the medicine. And what we do is we collect those data, we manage them, of course, and we analyze. we review them at the level of PRAC, and we assess the available data, and we decide what should be done. And then we communicate that. And again, we monitor what actions we have taken. So that's in the ideal world, the cycle of pharmacovigilance. And on the next slide is the how on monitoring the safety. And I took a vaccine because EMA has kindly made a lot of slides during the pandemic to show to people how we do the work that we do. And it's a very nice slide where you can see that we start monitoring already at the level of quality, at the level of toxicity. So everything that we see during the development is taken into account, is put into a risk management plans, we call it. And then once it's on the market, we have studies that we do, post-marketing studies, and the spontaneous recording of data. So that's how it's been done. And then in the next slide, I like this one very much, and I can only agree that EMA has lots of very kind people, because the slides were provided by Maria, and I like this one very much because it shows a very nice overview of the development. The only thing that might be missing here is one of the things that was the trigger for the pharmacovigilance legislation as we have now, and that's the mediator crisis that was in France in 2009. It started and it's still ongoing. And mediator was a medicine for diabetes in more obese patients, but the drug was also very often used in healthy obese patients. It worked very, very well, and people lost a lot of weight, but they had a very rare adverse event of valves in the heart that were misformed, and due to that, lung hypertension could develop. It's a very rare event. It occurs not very often, but what we saw there is that, for example, in Spain, it was taken off the market. In Belgium, it was taken off the market. In the Netherlands, it was never allowed on the market. But before we had this European system of pharmacovigilance, member states did not know from each other what they were doing or what was occurring in their jurisdiction. And that might explain why the product stayed on the market quite long in France. So that was the reason for the current pharmacovigilance, and we try to prevent things like this from happening. If we can go to the next slide, there I have an overview of pharmacovigilance, and it's a very nice summary of what we do, and where we also need healthcare professionals and patients, and that's collecting the information, deciding if there are new or changing. Sometimes we know, for example, that headache occurs, but it's in a more severe form, or it's much more frequent than we originally had thought. And based on that data, we decide if action is needed, we take those action, and then we communicate that. And the last one is a very, very important one. It's under development, also the guidance for that. And that's what is the impact of our actions? Because of course, action can have intended impact, protecting patients better, but it could also have unintended impact. For example, patients not getting the drug or the medicine that they might need. So it's very important that we analyze that. On the next slide, I think it might be a slide that you have maybe already seen, but it's the process by which a product can go through this centralized procedure. Next slide, please. And we have two important committees available in the post-marketing part. Oh, I'm sorry, there was some animation in there, but if we can go to the next slide. Then you can see the CHMP, which is well, simply said, the committee that allows or decides whether the product can be on the market, in which dosing and for which exact indication. And the PRAC, who starts looking already in cooperation with the CHMP in an early stage to see where the gaps in knowledge might be, where certain risks might be that need to be further characterized, but can only be further characterized once it's on the market. And so you can imagine that those two committees work very closely together, especially at the time of the authorization, but also later on if PRAC, for example, identifies a certain important adverse reactions, and it might be a solution that the dosing is lowered, we very closely cooperate with CHMP in order to come up with the best advice. So this is, I'll come back to that a little bit later on all the activities that PRAC has. So if we can go to the next slide, I would like to show you our patient representatives. We have, oh, maybe I haven't put in that slide, or maybe, oh, let's hope it comes, but we have two very helpful patient representatives, Katelijne van Doorne and Virginie Hiver, and they are very active in the PRAC. They attend all the plenary meetings and or if needed, all kind of other meetings. They're also very involved in drafting guidance for example, like I said, the impact research. Do we have the effects that we intend or not? They're very active in labeling if we have certain ADRs that need to be reflected in the product information. But the PRAC is basically composed of the one member from each member state, and each member state can also have an alternate. And in addition to that, we have the patient representative, one alternate, one healthcare professional and an alternate, and 6 members are being appointed by the European Commission based on the composition of the PRAC. They try to add relevant scientific knowledge. So next slide, please. I think I might have skipped, there they are. I changed it in my own slides, but these are our patient representatives, and like I said, they are extremely active, and I think it's a very, very demanding well, a job, I think, because these are long days. It's a lot that they can provide input on, so it's not that they only look at some category of products or some therapeutic area. They are very involved in everything. And yeah, I work now for quite a while at the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, and I think they are doing a very, very good job. So if we can go to the next slide, and let's see if I surprise myself again. I hope not. No, there's the agenda. So these are the topics that the PRAC looks at, and that's on the top, the periodic safety updates. As you might have heard, every pharmaceutical company has to provide those for every medicine that they have on the market. Then we have the risk management plans. These are very relevant at the time of the licensing, because at that time we decide on a kind of project and program, what needs to be done, what needs to be further characterized and further researched. The PAS studies, the post-authorization safety studies. We have safety issues and communication. Also, the PRAC is responsible for pharmacovig inspections, provided they are for pharmacovigilance. Additional monitoring, and that's, maybe you have seen that before, the black triangle. ADR reporting the ADRs are being collected, and we perform signal detection and signal management. We do that with the help of EMA colleagues, of course, and EUDA-Vigilance. But basically, at the beginning of everything is the patient and the healthcare professional. If they do not report, we won't have any data. And we have urgent procedures, and we call them referral procedures, that are in-depth reviews. And you have the urgent ones that go very, very quickly. I have one example at the end if we have time. And of course, we deal with all kinds of emerging safety issues and decide what would be the best regulatory way forward there. If we can go to the next slide, I try to put it in a more visual way, where we, all the different things that PRAC is doing. So what I think is very important is that every procedure has its own timetable. So we know, for example, exactly when the next PSUR will be coming. We have for signal detection certain default timelines, for example, 60 days, so 2 months to come to a conclusion. But if it's urgent, we can have a 30 or even a 15. And if absolutely needed, we can try to decide in a 24-hour procedure. And that doesn't happen very often, fortunately, but it is possible. So if we can go to the next slide. And that's what safety actions can be taken. So for example, we can decide it's very important that there is a reflection of a certain adverse event because we feel that it's related to the product. So we need to update the product information. So it's reflected and we inform healthcare professionals and patients in a better way. We also have the possibility to use, for example, website from EMA or website from national agencies, or for example, a Dear Healthcare Professional letter. So we send out a letter to healthcare professionals. We can restrict the access to a medicine, and in the most severe case, we can revoke a medicine. Next slide, please. And what's very important is that, of course, we also decide, if we can go one slide back, we also decide whether there is no action required. And I think it's very important to realize that before we decide that we do not need any action, there are always very careful discussions on that. So sometimes it's even more difficult to decide, okay, we don't need to do anything now. So that's a very challenging decision, and it's not a kind of default at all. So that's why I like to highlight that one. Next slide, please. What of course is, well, in a way, I'm proud of that because I was involved in the first public hearing, and that was quite an exciting and new tool that we had available. We have had only 2 up until now, one for valproate, one for the quinolones, and there are very clear criteria developed together with the patients and the patients working party when to have a public hearing. And for every in-depth review, we always review the criteria, and it's been decided at the level of PRAC whether or not there is a need, where also patients and healthcare professionals are involved in that decision. And because those procedures are not, of course, closed in a very short period of time, there's always the possibility to come back and to review and reassess and decide that we would need a public hearing. We have more often, we use the stakeholders meetings where patients and healthcare professionals are invited and discuss a specific topic. So if we can go to the next slide. I think for this audience, you might be interested in where the patient role is important. So you can click a few times, I think 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Excellent. Thank you. That's it. So like I said, collect information on the potential side effects, and I will use also this opportunity to ask you to report any side effects. If you use a medicine, please report them to us. It's so very important to have the data. Then we decide whether there's a new something, or there's a frequency changing or a severity changing. For example, we thought you had only a stomach ache, but it turns out you could have a bowel perforation, to name a nice example, for example. We decide whether there's action needed. So even if we do not take action, then there is a very intense discussion on that. And if needed, we take action and we communicate that to the users if it's an important change. And then I have 2 slides on the, I think 3 slides on the Fenspiride. Do I have still time to take them? Yeah, good. Thank you so much. And thank you for bearing with me. Not that long ago, if we can go to the next slide, we had a referral for Fenspiride. It's a cough medicine, and it was indicated for the treatment of symptoms. So it's not a cure, it's a symptomatic medicine, and it was licensed in a limited number of European countries. You see them listed here, and there was always a little bit of concern surrounding arrhythmias, possible arrhythmias. And France had requested the marketing authorization holder to do a study, in a preclinical study, so not on patients, but in the laboratory, to look at possibilities of QT prolongation. That's a cardiac arrhythmia where you have at the kg, a certain prolongation of a certain time period. And as such, that's not a real big problem, but it can trigger very serious arrhythmias and even sudden cardiac death. So France decided, based on the information that they had obtained from this laboratory study, that they felt that we need an in-depth review, and that's and that it was an urgent one, and therefore they triggered an article, a referral, and Article 107. So next slide, please. And that's a referral that is a fast one. That's a 30-day timetable. So in a very short period of time, a lot of data are being collected, reviewed, assessed, discussed, and we come to a conclusion quite swiftly and promptly. And what we do then is we consider all the available evidence that is collected. So preclinical, clinical data, data from post-marketing, from the literature, and we look at the benefits. So what is the product doing and how well is it performing, and what are the risks and how is that balanced? And the issue with Q3 prolongation is that we know it may occur, but we don't know always in whom it might occur. So that's very difficult. And even if it does occur, it not always leads to rhythm disturbances. So it's a very difficult one to identify and almost impossible to prevent, because it's a kind of, a lot of factors need to work together to have the occurrence of a sudden death. So we, PRAC, felt after very careful discussion, and we can go to the next slide, that the benefit-risk balance was not positive anymore, because this reported side effect, we didn't see any way to have mitigation of this serious risk. And on the other hand, and that's the benefit side of the product, is that it's not a life-saving drug, it's not a curing medicine. So it's in benign respiratory diseases, it's cough, it's expectoration. So based on that, it was felt that there are other medicines that have the same kind of impact and the same kind of efficacy. So we wouldn't have a patient population that could not be treated. And at the same time, we saw there were very serious side effects, very rare, fortunately, but nevertheless, we didn't see any way on how to prevent these from happening. So if you weigh those two things, then we came up with a negative benefit risk, and that's what happened in the case of Fenspiride. And that's just an example on how you weigh things. It's a very short, brief summary, but I think it might be insightful for you to see the kind of discussions that we have at PRAC. And this is also my last slide. So over to you, please, Isabel, and thank you very much once again for having me.